remarkably.
Hello, and welcome to our current installment of Questions. Thank you again for joining us. We kind of teased this week a little bit last week. This week we're going to continue in our end times thinking, as well as kind of thinking through our contemporary events and how that frames how we behave and how we think through our worldview. As we teased last week, this week we have Dr. Bruce Galenza with us. He is a psychology professor at GPRC, and in fact, actually about 9 years ago, taught me my very first psychology course, which I greatly enjoyed and learned a lot from. Also joined by Duff, who you'll recognize from our other weeks. The three of us are going to have a conversation together about some of the perspectives that Bruce is going to bring to us, just psychological explanations for how specifically evangelicalism, some end times thinking, is thinking through our contemporary events and how they're interpreting that and how that's leading to current behavior. And so with that, I'll just let Bruce start in on things.
Thank you. Afternoon. My purpose is to help people understand eschatology, end times, evangelical Christianity. And I think one way to attack this is to find parallels between what's going on in the States with the Trump phenomenon.
Which we're all very aware of.
Which we are more aware of, and the evangelical movement might be a mystery to us, but we're more familiar with Trump phenomenon, so perhaps we can understand one in terms of the other.
Yeah.
The point that I see as a complete parallel between the two, because almost all of Trump's followers are evangelicals, and almost all evangelicals support Trump.
Yeah.
So to me,
in the States.
In the States. Yeah. Well,
let's be very
have
specific.
Our movement here in Canada, quite
sure.
right.
Yeah.
But in terms of a Venn diagram, it's almost a complete overlap.
Yeah.
It's the same thing. Both are cults. Both deny reality. Both are living in fantasy worlds, and both look to the end times, which are coming up very shortly, apparently, where Jesus will come back and fix everything for us, and Donald Trump will be back in the White House and fix everything for us. So I see it as pretty much the same thing.
It is very similar to like a savior thinking.
Very much
like
so.
Fix what is wrong.
Yeah.
Yeah.
We need a daddy to come take care of us because we're not doing it ourselves. Yeah. And I first became aware of the Trump phenomenon, I think, when he was in his inauguration, and they took pictures of the Washington Mall of his inauguration crowd, and then he had pictures of Obama's from 8 years ago, and he showed these two pictures together side by side, and he said, see, my inauguration crowd was way bigger than Obama. Well, just looking at it, you could see Obama's was about 3 times the size of Trump's. Yeah. And folks would go around, journalists would go around with these two pictures and say, okay, which is larger? And then Trump is, well, obviously the Trump, denying their own senses and going with what Trump said. And what's going on here? There are hundreds of doctoral dissertations and master's theses currently being interviewed or being conducted, and the question is, why are people so damn stupid? Why are they getting so off reality? And the clue came when Kellyanne Conway, who was press secretary for Trump, was interviewed on CNN, and she's going off on her own tangent here, and the interviewer says, yeah, but the facts say something other, and she said, but we're working on alternative facts.
Right.
What the hell are alternative facts?
Yeah.
And you get the idea. And now we're
as we all learned over the next 4 years what alternative facts are.
Exactly, and I could give you 100 examples of Trump telling lies that are obviously empirically wrong, and people buy it. So what's going on here? My answer to both the Trump thing and end times is fear. It's fear. Yeah. In the 1950s, white Anglo-Saxon Protestant men ran everything. Women didn't exist, apparently, in the 50s. Yeah. And minorities were not to be found. And
in the West.
Quite right. And then things started changing. Women, women's liberation in the 60s, started going to universities and getting jobs. Next thing you know, they're in the boardroom and they're running things. And then the youth movement in the 60s, kids were not staying home and doing what they were supposed to do and being conservative and copying. They were wearing their hair long and strange clothing and music. I couldn't understand it. And then the civil rights, Minorities start going in, and the white Anglo-Saxon Protestant is going, what is going on here? I don't understand, and I'm frightened of it.
Yeah. How does fear? So you're looking at those two pictures.
Yep.
Obama's picture with the
Yep.
large crowd, Trump's picture with the small crowd.
Yep.
How does fear convince you that one is real and one isn't?
I'm getting to that.
Yeah, yeah.
You're quite right.
Stand by.
That is the question. Stand by, I'm on it. Yeah.
You bet.
But they didn't understand it, and it was all random chance to them, and therefore they're frightened, and frightened people are dangerous people. But pareidolia, help me out here. The tendency that the human mind perception system cannot deal with randomness.
Right.
It's got to see faces in clouds and constellations, and they need to interpret it. They can't understand it, so therefore they create their own alternative reality, which they can understand because they built it. You see, and if you get more people to agree with you, well, then you have validation of your own particular views. And along with that, the Persian philosopher Mani said the worst lie that the world has ever seen, and everyone believed him.
Yeah.
That is to say, there's good and there's evil.
Right.
And there are good people and there are evil people, and there are good countries and there are bad countries, and the narrative of the universe is the eternal fight between good and evil.
Constantly trying to find heroes and villains in that fight.
Quite right. And no one likes to see themselves as the bad guy.
Yeah.
Therefore, we have to be the good guy,
Yes.
and therefore anyone who is disagreeing with us has to be the bad guy.
Yes.
And if we don't like women's liberation, then women are evil, and minorities are evil, and kids are evil, and Muslims and Mexicans, and pick your enemy. They've got to have an enemy in order to self-validate our views. So they create these alternative realities in which they live in, and you can never question them by showing reason and evidence, because their view isn't based on reason and evidence; it's belief. So you can't ask them, why do you believe this? Because well, I know it to be correct, and you can't question it in any sense.
Right. It reminds me of the Middle Ages, where you had these debates between theologians, and the trick was to, what they called it, finding the tail, which was getting the other guy to say something that was clearly false or wrong theologically, and then you had labeled him as a heretic, and you could pick him up by the tail and drop him in the garbage can of theology and never think about it anymore.
Discarding everything else that he said.
Once you've got a label, you can stop thinking.
That's Ben Shapiro today, if you know it.
Yes, it is actually.
Exactly.
I think that's most political pundits today, actually, and coming from like an end times church perspective, there's very much labels being bandied around inside of a Christian evangelical belief system. So the labels that Duff and I talked about last week, premillennial, postmillennial, do believe in the rapture or not, all those things. Even inside of a world that holds a similar worldview, there's very definitive labels there. Everyone goes, as Duff said, pick up by the tail and goes, I'm afraid of you. You're not the good guy anymore. Even inside of a movement, and you might see that inside of any kind of.
Yeah, when I was growing up, the big label was liberal.
Yeah.
If you're an evangelical, the liberals were the bad guys.
Yeah.
The Bultmans, the Bonhoeffers of all people, people that were actually not sure the Bible was literally dictated, and who did not have a calendar for end times linked to Russia or China, and didn't have helicopter gunships instead of locusts. Hal Lindsey, of course, wrote several famous books and made a lot of money about it being late for the great planet Earth.
Right.
And other famous evangelicals endorsed these things, and soon you had villains, heroes, labels, and then time charts linked to these threats. And at that point, what I saw was waves of fear, especially in the young people that I knew at the time, who were dreading the fact that, well, the end of the world will come in fire, it'll be nuclear fire, it'll be caused by a war between China, Russia, and the United States, and it's all going to be over, except for those who are raptured, lifted up in the air, and escape all of that.
So maybe Bruce can continue with some of his thoughts on how that comes about.
I lost my train.
Okay, you were talking about fear and Trump. And
fear. Alternative realities.
Alternative reality.
And they can't possibly entertain any conflict, because that means they are not who they think they are. They have not bought into the right thing, and oh my God, they might turn into liberals if they start thinking about things. So they have to reject all challenges to their particular view.
Yeah.
So where does the anxiety come I mean, the fear is sure, but I might be wrong.
Oh, no.
But what else?
No, that is a forbidden idea.
Oh, okay.
Yeah, for the love of God, consider the possibility that you might be wrong.
Yeah,
is not
that's
something.
Cromwell. Yeah, but I mean, then the fear that you're talking about, though.
Yeah.
What is it a fear of?
Yeah, what's the nagging?
Everything.
The root of it? Yeah.
Americans are the most terrified people on the face of the earth. God knows why.
Yeah.
But they are afraid of everything.
Yeah.
Primarily their own government. How you can be afraid of the government that you have elected is quite beyond me. But
Right.
yeah, their narrative is they broke away from England by fighting against tyranny,
Right.
and therefore you must always fight against tyranny wherever we can create it.
Yeah.
And this can be their government, or it can be Black Lives Matter, or
Yeah,
any
true.
movement
Yeah.
that you wish, of which I don't understand and I am not part of, and therefore is necessarily evil.
So why
And
do
that's scary stuff and very anxiety.
it is very anxiety driving. Why do you think, as we mentioned at the beginning, so we're drawing the parallels between two phenomenon, as you said,
Yeah, I think it's the
alternative.
same.
So why do you think that one group of people, from a psychological perspective, has bought into an alternate reality, is so quick to buy into another one, even if it doesn't agree to every principle they've held? That's been the big questions with Trump, is that as a man who holds no principles
Yes.
on the surface,
Yes.
as you embrace, but then you buy into that
Yeah.
message. And I think that might go along with our end times thinking that we were thinking with last week, in that as a principled person of a Christian faith, you believe in the stewardship of the planet, but then also you're saying it's going to die in a fire.
So why bother?
So why bother, kind of thing. So
Exactly.
how does one person who's supposed to think one way buy into something so also, given that fear and anxiety?
Yeah, they're supposed to think that way.
Yeah.
I would not be of the personal opinion, that evangelicals are Christian.
Right.
They are diametrically opposed
Yeah.
to anything that Jesus taught.
You're primarily talking about the political wing, I suppose.
Well,
anyway.
it's all political.
Yes.
Because they don't accept any of the teachings at all.
Yeah.
Evangelical Christianity is not a religion so much as a political party, and
Yeah.
their main point is power.
Yeah.
You may remember the prayer breakfast of 2 years ago in February, and all of the top echelons of the government were there, and Donald Trump was there, and all of the big names in the evangelical movement. And pastor got up and he gave the blessings, and he ended his speech by saying, Jesus said, love those who hate you and forgive those who... Okay. And there was silence in the room. He sat down, and Donald Trump stood up and he said, I disagree with that. And the place just roared with approval, rejecting Jesus entirely and going with Trump's interpretation. There it is. It's a political movement.
Right.
It has nothing to do with Christianity.
Right.
They claim to be following Jesus, but they have no idea what he's saying.
Right.
And as Duff was saying earlier, Trump is seen as Jesus incarnate. Jesus chose Trump to help us, to lead us, to protect us against all these enemies all the way around us in these end times.
I think maybe that's where we can draw it kind of back into that thinking, is that where the tendency to believe one and the other, where the similarities arise, is that you're looking to the return of somebody to save what's
to
going,
save us from horrible, terrible times.
Yeah. No matter what that return might look like, and what belief in that that controversy might look like.
I don't think they go that far as to what it might look like.
Yeah.
It's looking back to the Garden of Eden.
Yeah.
In that time, and Steven Pinker.
Yeah.
You know Steven Pinker, one of my favorite authors. He was once asked, what's the purpose of living?
Right.
And he said, if you're a conservative, you have no purpose for living, because you look back to the wonderful Garden of Eden times, or the 1950s in Trump's case, and everything's going to hell in a handbasket.
Huge loss.
And there's nothing we can do about it other than delay it, so you might as well give up. Whereas if you're a liberal, you look back at the muck we crawled out of in the Dark Ages, and look where we have come, and now your job is to help society develop and to become better.
So that's one of the interesting things in the line of history.
Yes.
The idea of progress is an idea that comes out of Christianity and is taken over by the Enlightenment, right?
Yes.
And then suddenly now Christianity in the evangelical strain has become afraid of progress
Right.
Yes.
and sees it as the enemy.
And anti-science.
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah.
You know, and ironically, science once again began with people saying, "Well, let's see what God did with nature, and we'll explore it." But suddenly, around the mid-19th century, it got out of hand. You
Yes.
know,
Yeah.
and
I think historically that's the rejection of an entire way of thinking due to one lightning thing that I kind of brought up before. Just like if you have one source of information that defines your whole thinking. So evolution, for instance, that's what happened in the 19th century predominantly. And so if you had to think that way, that means you had to reject everything else. And so that's where the fear came from. Like, it's just like the...
And the remarkable thing now is numbers. It seems that at one time we could say, well, there was always a small group of fundamentalists in the 1920s, 30s, 40s, 50s. And then suddenly the evangelical movement, especially with the kind of cultural war that began, called the Culture War, has now become a phenomenon that, as you say, is entrenched in power and appears to be not a majority, but enough of a large block to be a spoiler.
Yeah.
You know, the idea that we've got, you know, a third of American voters now who are diehard Republicans in spite of whatever. They're post-truth, you know, in that sense. And that's enough to paralyze American government right now.
Yeah.
Because of the intimidation factor they have as well.
So to parallel this a bit, again, with the end times thinking. So from a faith-based perspective, you can look at things around you and say, you know, regardless of how it might happen, there is an end of the world event, a resurrection event, even if that causes you to live hopefully rather than fearfully. Like even if you convince yourself of all those things, as Duff and I talked about last week. Outside of that being a possibility, saying that there is no such thing event, how does seeing the world that way from a psychological perspective, what causes us to think that way? Even if we're like we're thinking of like an end of the world thing, like a return of a savior saying that everything is wrong, how does that come about? Is that still fear, even if you're hopeful and all that stuff about the end? Yeah. If you have fear of current events.
I don't know. You remember your psychology? You remember?
I do, but I'm not the expert, and I don't want to quote it incorrectly. I do remember a lot about schema, and a lot about telling yourself stories.
Yes.
Yeah.
I'm very much into the narrative.
Yes, into the narrative thinking, which is a big part of faith.
Yeah. And politics and everything else. But Leon Fessinger spoke of cognitive dissonance.
Yeah.
That is when you have one point of view and something is kind of nudging around the edge of it saying, and that's very anxiety producing. Yeah. Maybe I don't understand. I got to hang on to my understanding, push it aside, but it keeps encroaching on you, you know, and it's a terrifying thing. So you can have faith and say, oh, I believe, well, you have to in order to reach salvation or be a Trumpite. But it never really quite fits because reality is always there impinging. Yeah.
Right.
So we have authoritarianism, maybe an upbringing and a mindset, worldview, and then we have absolutism in terms of judging, evaluating things. Now, does that go back, like the old story, of course, if you're Freudian, is it goes back to your childhood nurture. But is there more to it than that? I mean, can we just all stand in front of the mirror and say, I renounce my childhood? Or how do we get out of this mess? This loop that we're in.
How do we like to bring it personally about? Within a realm of faith, I can reject all of the things that we've been talking about as far as American evangelical type faith. It'd be a liberal voting and progressive thinking and climate change affirming and all these types of things that don't fit into that camp. And thinking about, but still believe in an end time event, and still believe in a savior figure. And so where's my cognitive dissonance? Like trying to engage with reasons. I kind of want to go with this. Like we are talking about belief in something that may not fit the picture, as you said at the beginning. So I'm looking at that Obama picture and I'm going, well, that's real. That kind of stuff. But then somehow believing that Trump's coming back. It's somewhere in the middle. You know what I mean?
I do. Well, we. Go to Freud if you want.
That's what I want. That's what I want to explore, like the psychological explanations for things like these.
Freud pointed out that we are quite capable of holding two conflicting opinions at the same time and not noticing them.
Right.
That's no big deal. People can do that all the time. So you can believe in both. And to the extent that they become conflicting, then we have cognitive dissonance. Right. But that rarely happens if you're so entrenched in your particular view.
Right, inside the egg, so to speak.
Yeah,
Yes,
that's
right
right.
on.
I was talking about Henri Bergson's idea that if you're in a phenomena, you have intuition,
Yeah.
and it's a self-reinforcing worldview. But if you're outside that phenomena
Yeah.
and don't have any connection with it, you can be analytical
Yeah.
and weigh it and measure it and say this is not reality.
So how do we, from a psychological perspective, ever get outside the phenomena? Isn't that impossible? As someone from inside of faith, how do you go to someone outside of faith without after being the person outside of faith?
Yeah.
And abandoning whatever
Yeah,
you believe,
you know what I mean?
which is very threatening.
Yeah.
I've read a dozen articles on that recently. How do you get through, mostly in terms of family? Families are being split up, and the younger people, the liberal educated people, and their parents are maggots, pardon me. Make America great again, MAGA, and you tack a T on it, you become MAGA, and that becomes a not very nice term for these folks. But the kids are saying, how do we get through to our people? And let us not underestimate the power of propaganda from Fox News, because you got 24-hour a day in your face. Everything is wrong, it's horrible, everyone is evil, and they're all going to die, type of thing. And they got the TV on 24/7.
Right.
And how do you get through these guys? Look at these pictures, Obama's inauguration. Nope. They refuse to look at it. And how do we get through? No one's really come up with an answer that I know of.
How does one person actually move through it? Because it's called deconstruction, faith that goes with that.
Deprogramming.
Deprogramming, deconstruction.
Yeah.
How does one move from inside the phenomena to outside the phenomena? If it's that's what I'm kind of getting at. Is that how is that even possible? Instead of from the external influence, trying to persuade somebody to go outside. If you're inside the phenomena and you're going, there is no cognitive dissonance. I believe everything through this filter. How does one even? Because people move from one to the other. So how is that possible if you so strongly believe in the one filter? The
general consensus is you cannot attack that view with reason and evidence, because it's not based on reason and evidence. It's based on faith, belief, etc. And therefore you have to attack it from that perspective.
Right.
So you don't get up in their face and say, you're wrong, because right now they're going to dig their heels in. You're right. But have you considered your beliefs concerning, and you attack it from a faith belief perspective type of thing. And I don't think they've had much success with it, according to my readings, but that's the best we got.
Yeah. Martin Luther had a situation where he was so locked into the idea that if you have an unconfessed sin, you're going to be in purgatory for an infinitely long time. And you had to do whatever you could, the Latin is facere quod se est, to get yourself ready for saving faith. But how do you know when you've done enough, right? Yeah. And so an observant theologian once said, with a system like that, you either break down or you break out.
Right.
And Luther finally said, rubbish, and broke out. Right. But he did it with the selective and understanding of certain verses of the Bible. Yeah. Is it possible that we're looking at a situation where people have to kind of break themselves out by a reinterpretation of what they believe, or re-identification with aspects of the Bible? Because the funny thing is, the book of Revelation was written roughly 90 AD.
Yep.
And the irony is that's along with the book of Daniel, which depending on your archaeology is 600 BC or so.
Or 100. Depends on your archaeology.
Exactly. And so you end up with these two ancient books being at the heart of the fundamental angst of our time. Yeah. And the irony is both are prophetic books, which are full of poetic imagery. Who was it? Said, was it Schweitzer that said nobody could think of strange events better than John, the Apostle John? But these things are suddenly becoming concretized in their minds, and I ask myself why.
Yeah. So there's that with them too, because like some of the Trump phenomenon has been the prophecies and all that kind of stuff.
Very much
so that comes out of a tendency for people within a certain type of thinking to think along those lines, and that everything that's written down in a certain way is prophesying future, and so they're trying to interpret. Yeah. So I'm going to go here. What kind of phenomenon encourages people to look for signs, a concrete familiar? Because Trump is a sign of something that they've already believed. So that's how it ties into the end times. Trump is a sign of something they've believed for a while out of that type of writing.
Right, the Savior.
And something, honestly, that's something I've believed that a while, even though I don't believe in the signs. So how did the signs come out?
Signs are very powerful. Symbols are
symbols are very powerful. So maybe kind of tell us a little bit about that with the power from the psychological. perspective, if you can. There's a lot to get into. But,
Yeah.
I know.
Sure.
I'm not giving you fair shake here.
I can wing it. Yeah. We deal with signs and symbols all the time. Everyone does.
Yeah.
And if, as I was saying, we don't understand society or where it's going, we clutch to signs to say, yeah, we are right. You don't need to question your own existence, type of thing, because other people agree with us, and there are signs in the heavens that we have to be right.
Right.
There was one story some years ago. A church was bombed, and 12 children died, and the thing went up in flames, and in the ashes there was a cross.
Right.
Wow. There's a sign. Jesus just let 12 children be killed, and he's going to give us signs. But that's what people cling to, those tiny little things that say there is something more to life and our existence than what we can see.
So from that perspective, those types of symbols are what will continue to propagate the belief in end times event, regardless of what that looks like. Yeah.
Well, whatever the sign is, it shall be interpreted as that.
What about numerology?
What about numerology?
The constant use of numbers.
Yes.
Where does that come from? Is it a neurosis? Is it a special type of mental dysfunction? There are some people that are so driven by fact.
Yes.
And by numbers in particular. Is that a kind of mind that must be concrete?
I'm not against numbers. I think numbers are divine. Let's talk Pythagoras here.
Galileo.
I think he's talking about the metaphysical interpretation of numbers.
Course.
Yeah.
Of course.
Yes.
But numbers have power.
Yeah. Okay.
And therefore, if we have some number, it means something beyond that which we can see.
We give it a symbolic value.
A symbolic value, sure.
Yeah. And cognitively, though, it has very real symbolic value, even if it's not rooted in, even if what it's symbolizing is not deemed to be true.
Well, that's got nothing to do with it.
It's so funny. I mean, I had a credit card.
Yeah, go ahead. Yeah.
No, continue.
I'm saying that, when you said.
Well, the idea of truth.
Yeah.
Becomes a real sticky thing here.
Yes, it does.
What is truth? And for the empiricist, it's that which is supported by reason and evidence.
Yeah.
And for the faith-based, it's that which I believe is true. I don't believe what is true. It is true if I believe it.
Yeah.
You see, and funny damn thing, but Jesus agrees with everything I believe in. So it's projection of what my belief onto the world history.
Yeah. In that way, that I think that there's a common problem between two sets of worldviews.
Very much so.
In one that the Jesus says everything I believe in, or agrees with everything I believe in. There's two people fighting against that way of thinking. One is the atheist, and one is the pastor. From two very motivations. So
Well, that's why I think dialectic has a place here, because in the end, most people who are believers must dialect or be in dialectic with reality, but for some of them it's a rebuff. They back away. For others, it'll be perhaps something that corrodes, trickles away, slowly deconstructs some of that fixed worldview. You think of some of the people that have come out of these movements, have actually begun to ask that one question. They stop applauding Hitler first or something, and then they begin a process of disillusionment, of deconstruction.
Well, do you think it's a slow movement, or does it take a massive crisis of faith?
Well, the answer is both, depending on the person. I think an analytical person may be gradually saying these things, paradigm change.
Yeah.
These things don't add up. Eventually you say there's got to be a new way of doing it. But others say it was all a lie and crash, which is what Luther did. Yeah. And I think that's the question for a lot of our Christians today is, as we watch extreme things that don't add up, we look to our own answers, they don't add up.
Yeah.
How do we interact and dialogue
Yeah.
as critical thinkers, which is what this series is all about.
Yeah.
What is the best evidence? What is the logic internally and externally?
Yes.
And am I brave enough to face my
courage?
I think that what we've kind of discussed today is the understanding that within a phenomena there might not be logic internally. Is that a fair statement? like if you're inside of something that is an alternative view of reality, can there be any internal logic, or does it always have to be attacked from outside?
Good question.
Yeah.
Well, it has to be attacked from inside because it will resist anything from outside.
Yeah.
So, it's up to you guys.
You
Not
betcha.
us scientists.
Yeah.
It's up to you.
It's actually
the
a mythological deconstruction, the deep myths, right?
I've had a couple.
Go ahead.
I've had a couple of questions come in, and we're nearing the end of our time. This has been fascinating, so I've been paying attention to here instead of here, and so I might have to bring a few things back. I've just been reading them because I'm just trying to get the crux of it without confusing. So, going back to the beginning, I'm going to ask one first. We were talking about the power movement of evangelicals, and when we were talking about like the dissonance between Trump the person and the evangelical movement.
Yeah, he's the most unchristian person on the face of the earth, without doubt.
So this question goes along with that. Do evangelicals, quote unquote, realize that they are about power while saying they believe the teachings of the Bible and claim to follow them, or do they blindly follow their leader? Like, is it a cult? Is it something that they know that they're being dissonant, or is it something that?
Well, again,
are they blindly?
It's something that on the edges of consciousness.
Yeah.
If they knew they were being inconsistent, they would have to do something about it.
Yeah.
And as long as it doesn't slap them upside the face, they can believe. I mean, reality is what Trump says is true, as he said. What you see and what you hear is not true. What I am telling you is true.
Yeah.
Okay. So, the cultish following of non-questioning.
Yeah, it's been said.
And the same thing with the understanding. The same thing with the understanding that of contemporary events being signposts to the end of the world. Kind of idea is that it has to be that way. That there's like.
Yeah, this is that.
This is that kind of thing, and then there's no sense of reason that can persuade differently.
No.
Yeah, it's very interesting. Trump has been described as the first post-truth American president. Truly deconstructionist.
Yes.
You know?
An alternate reality that he has created that so many people have bought into. Yeah. And that's scary stuff.
It's useful. Yeah.
So I think you hinted at this already for another question that came in, talking about you can't attack things from a reason perspective. You have to attack it from a faith belief perspective,
because their view is not based on reason and
faith,
but on faith. Therefore.
So I don't know if this question was answered with that, or if you want to expound a bit. What is our response to an unrational, fear-based way of thinking? Yeah.
I have no idea.
Yeah. I'm sure you have experience with this quite a bit.
When I was in the States lecturing there, I was doing introductory psychology, and I was doing the nature-nurture controversy. And I got into nature as about to introduce genetic determinism, and I brought up the topic of evolution.
Yeah.
And a guy in the back row said, "That's wrong." What? What's wrong? The theory of evolution. It's all wrong. Oh, do you know what theory is? Nope. I just know it's wrong.
Right.
You know, like, where is he getting this from? He doesn't even know what it is, but he's already decided it's wrong. So I can stand up there and give him all the facts and evidence and reasons, and it's not going to make any difference at all.
Yeah. And I think
you got to find a different faith basis. Well, maybe we can put two together some way or other.
I think that actually kind of hits the nail on the head for maybe what we want to do with this series that we've been doing. Is that we don't want people of any stripe, and I imagine this is the parallel purpose to any kind of university course. Is you don't want a person standing up going, "That's right and that's wrong," and not being able to back that up with a sentence or two. And so I think this has been the purpose of this, is that if you're going to stand up and say that's wrong to anything, have you thought it through? And you may be wrong when you say that's wrong, but have you thought it through? I think is the first step to any kind of reasonable thinking. You know.
Well, what I say in class is, what reason and evidence do you have to support your view? Right. Or is it just a belief?
I distinctly remember that being written and asked on a paper, what reason and evidence do I have to make this assertion?
The great teacher question. Was it in red ink? Do you remember what color it was?
Yeah.
Used to say, "I made my papers bleed."
Yes,
right.
Quite right.
I have another question for Duff, actually. We are taught to be critical thinkers, and now we're told, however, except when it comes to school. And I find so hypocritical when it comes to school that we be thinkers, be innovative, but do not do this if you attend college, or want to work if you oppose the facts. Jeepers. Okay, I'm going to say that again.
Please.
All right. I'm just going to read it out how it says, and then we'll kind of come at this. We are taught to be critical thinkers, and now we are told, except when it comes to school. Oh, I think this person is saying, don't be critical be a critical thinker at faith, but don't be a critical thinker at
school,
in education. So like I think this person.
This is someone who has asked.
Yeah, this is someone who's asked the question. Yeah. So I'm gonna say what the rest of it said, but I think what they're saying. I'm hoping I'm doing this a fairness here. I think what they're saying is that in terms of maybe agenda, people tend to think in terms of agenda for something they disagree with, and how it is for something they agree with. So it's like how can you encourage to be? Isn't it hypocritical to think? To be critical thinkers in the direction of faith, but not be critical thinkers in the direction of, say, like a university course.
Like science?
And like science.
Sure.
And I think this is very easily answered for both. I know the answer to this, but I think both of you should say it instead of me.
Yeah.
Well, first of all, there's such a thing as a level playing field for reality.
Yes.
Okay? So 2 and 2 is 4. Unless you're prepared to develop alternative forms of mathematics and you discuss it, explain it, and so on, Same way, you look at a piece of, for example, in my writing, I write about how there's this large prejudice that chaplains never went on the battlefield until you look at their medical reports and you see a number of them died of bullets. You can't deconstruct a bullet.
Yeah.
Unless it was somehow Canadian fired from the back,
Right.
Which may have occurred in 1 or 2 cases, but generally speaking, we're looking at a reality. You have to interact with what is in fact established on both camps.
Right.
And often there is interrogative, there's a connecting point, even if your interpretations may vary, in the end, there's a sort of hard core of phenomena that, and when you go to university, that phenomena has to be acknowledged and the way it works. Science, after all, is not about discovering unalterable laws, because we know that the unalterable laws keep getting revised, especially in physics, every 20 or 30 years. When I was a young undergraduate, indeterminacy was the big thing, right? Bohr, Heisenberg, and then suddenly we discovered there are all kinds of subatomic particles that totally deconstructed that idea of even that, which was a statistical view of reality. You look at the same thing with archaeology. Everyone knew at one time there was no Nineveh. Well, we found it. Right. Bit by bit, the archaeology has reached a point now where even the most skeptical archaeologists would have to say that there are certain events and certain characters that we have enough evidence left behind that the probability is very high. And actually, a lot of our life is lived that way. Yeah. The probability that seatbelts will save your life is high. Because if you don't wear one and something bad happens, as I have flying, you can become a projectile inside the plane. Right. So there are those kinds of realities. If you don't get your vaccinations, you will get polio potentially if you're exposed to it. Right. I went to a country and worked in it for 3 months where you could date when the polio vaccine was introduced to that country by the age of the people wearing braces. Yep. Right. Those things become phenomena that if your faith says that's not true, then you have to ask yourself, what is your faith based on? Is there a phenomenon of reality you can connect it with? Yeah. Now, the bottom line is that the world of science continues to develop and grow. Established laws and facts are constantly being revised because that's the nature of science. It's a progressive thing. History is a progressive thing. On the other hand, the question of faith is one that has to look at that question of why does my faith have to have a fact? And why is the fact that was presented as that 20 years ago, that fact has perhaps been supplanted, but the faith factor is different. It's very simple to say all truth. If you believe in truth, and of course if you don't believe in truth, you're going to have difficulty when your paycheck doesn't come on time and things like that. All truth is part of a reality continuum that we share with people who believe in God and don't. What's the difference? We may attach a providential interpretation to everything, or we may say, "Oh, we just don't know yet what the providential connection is."
Yeah, I think that's what's being discussed here is attaching that and the irrationality of that and how that can be explained.
The worst thing in my classes at university was somebody who would get up and try to tell the professor they was wrong because they contradicted the Bible. When in fact, those of us who knew the Bible, and those of us who knew the Bible knew that particular interpretation was a labeling process, not a learning process.
Right.
Those are the Christians that you kind of wanted to take out back and have a little talk with, about how to behave.
Yeah.
Because often it's bad manners,
as
opposed to knowledge.
Yeah. I think this last questioner, I think we're doing that somewhat justice with the answers. They had a very specific issue that was prompting the question, and that I think I'm just going to address the questioner. This issue might be in terms of thinking through in terms of like freedom, political freedom, and individualistic freedom, rather than in critical thinking and your ability to challenge, like your ability of your mind to challenge something and think through things, as opposed to your permission to do so. This person brought up, why can't they talk about the vaccine at school?
Yeah.
And so I think the critical thinking through COVID, which we don't have time to address today, and all the evidence is there. If I can say this instead of you guys cut me off, if I just want to kind of bring the conversation and help the questioner, but it still keep us on topic. That may not be a critical thinking question as opposed to not being able to bring it up at school might just be a permission thing. Does that encourage critical thinking or not? I think we all have personal opinions on that, probably, as whether you can bring something up or not. Yeah, and which is university, you should be able to bring it up, I guess.
Yeah. I interpreted that question very differently.
Okay, yeah, no, well, that was
the way you folks have.
Yeah.
To me,
please.
That's a misconception that is out there in the world, in that professors of science tell students what to think.
Yes, and this is where I was going to go, actually.
No.
Yeah.
37 years in the classroom, I have never told students what to think, and I've never heard any other professor of any discipline saying, we teach them how to think, we give them the tools to critically examine. We never tell them what to think.
Yeah.
And you may remember the courses. I say, don't believe anything, least of all me. I could have an agenda.
Yeah.
And then we throw up a theory and then start criticizing it.
Yeah.
Theories are meant to be attacked and criticized. People are not.
Yeah.
But here's an idea. What do you think of it? And we play a little game called Stump the Professor.
Yeah.
I take the view of a Freud or a Skinner and say, I'm holding this. You guys attack me and see where you can poke holes in it. It is not the case.
Yeah.
We tell them this theory is true. You have to believe it. Never.
Yeah, and I want to back that up, actually. As I said, I've taken a course with Bruce and many other people of differing worldviews from mine, and the same worldviews from mine, and I've done 8 years of college in different circumstances.
Yeah.
And I just want to say that I want to back that up. I think the perception of not being encouraged to think comes from having your eyes opened a little bit to a world outside of your way of thinking when you previously grew up. So, and any way of thinking, let's just not talk about just faith here. So and that challenge sometimes looks like an agenda. And you know what, even if there is an underlying agenda there, it's not as blatant or purposeful or even present as you think. And that's been my own personal experience.
Yeah.
And that's what we wanted to create with this series, is how to think through things, especially when it's difficult to do so in the moment of initial challenge when you've never had to think that way before.
Exactly, which is my story at university as well.
So I think that's what we wanted. Actually, we've gone on a little bit longer than what we normally do, but this has been a good thing. So I've been keeping it going.
We worked, I guess, pretty hard as well.
Yeah, and so I just wanted to back Bruce up with what he's saying. Is that as someone who's very, I wouldn't say well educated, but as someone who's been exposed to a lot of educational circumstances, I want to back that up. That predominantly that's been my experience, is that an initial reaction to a challenge has always been a defensive. That person has an agenda, and the farther you go through it, the more you go, okay, I'm learning how to think through this, and I may not agree with them, but I got a challenge, like, can I disagree with somebody who's teaching me this?
That's right.
They do know more about the topic than I do. So there's all those constant self-analytical questions that go through when you are being educated. So I would say to the questioner, I think critical thinking is always encouraged, even if there's a certain atmosphere in different areas. be it inside of a church building, be it inside of a university, be it inside of a conversation with a like-minded group of people, creating that atmosphere where it may appear like these conversations are not as permittable. In terms of your COVID vaccine comment, that's more explicit, and there may be political pressure to keep that quiet, and that's not a critical thinking question, that's a freedom question.
School teachers and school administrators
Yeah.
want order and conformity and control because they're working with young minds and they feel ultra responsible and protective. It does mean, though, that as they get higher up in the grades and into university, they should be encouraged to turn loose from those restrictions and begin to ask the big whys and the big hows. And when a school system shuts that down, as the students get older, it's failed. And the same is true of churches, by the way.
Same, very, very, and I think that's what we've kind of approached here. Is that, and I wanted to really, really, really stress that what we want is the constant challenge of how to think. And again, the initial reaction to that challenge is, it's going to be defensiveness. I think I'm telling psychologists this, but I think you could explain that. Definitely the initial reaction, anything that you hold dear to yourself, is going to be defensiveness, because you're not just deconstructing a belief system, you're deconstructing who you are. And that's what I learned from Bruce in a very introductory way, is how to think through that, deconstruction, how to think through that breaking down and holding on to who you want to be, and holding on to the fundamentals of who you are, but willing to break down the peripherals in a reasonable way. Which is the endeavor that we've tried to do here. Is there anything else that you guys wanted to say before we kind of closed up?
Well, I'm going to be talking about the dialogue between reason and revelation on Saturday in my heritage course, and taking us through the story of the church battling back and forth and rapidly growing, even as it fails and flounders around labeling and persecution and everything else. Overall, generally there's been a cumulative growth of wisdom that educated Christians will look at this, and if they are mature educated Christians, will not spend their time deploring, ridiculing. They'll be saying things like, well, here's what we do know. We know more than we did. There was a time, after all, when everybody thought metanoia in Greek meant do penance. And then somebody said, wait a minute, that's not what it meant. In New Testament Greek, it meant repent. Well, those things are worth learning, But there's other words, too, that we've learned a lot about since. And in those things, the interpretive power of Christianity has grown, even as the waves of popular prejudice have made it oppression and oppressive in missions, in other areas, and now in politics. Because people turn to it for mythic power, which masks their own inabilities or their own unwillingness to be challenged by what they learn. Like I say, you stand in the mirror and you say, what are my fears? And that's the same story that someone who's coming out of 12-step or someone that's coming out of a very narrow religious upbringing has to ask themselves if they're going to grow. What are my fears?
Is there anything you wanted to add at all?
I think you summed that very nicely.
Okay, very good. Well, I appreciate you sticking with us. We've gone in a little bit longer, but I wanted to give this a little bit of a longer break, and I imagine, who knows what kind of future conversations we might have. Thank you again for joining, and just as a little plug, if you have faith stories, if you have belief stories and questions, whether you want to be on here talking or whether you want to ask questions and have somebody on here talk through that, please do send it in. We would love to address these things with you or for you or alongside you in any way possible to help you think through what you believe and either defend it or break it down. Honestly, either way.
And I want to give a special thanks to Bruce, who walked into this willingly,
blindly,
eyes wide open, but has been able to be a stimulating thinker for both of us, me as a colleague and you as a student, and remains a stimulating person to be around.
Yes,
it was fun.
Thank you very much.
Thank you for the invitation.
Good stuff.
See you 2 weeks from now.